How do you see that creative brief now changing with the onset of all these tools that we have available? So like you say, we've kind of spoken about the output, quality, scale, speed, everything coming together under one. Now let's kind of go back to the start of the process.
Yeah.
How do you think that might change how we look at the brief now?
Yeah. Well, I think traditional briefs had probably always been sort of fixed, in a moment of time. And they're always kind of helping people understand the context that something was operating in and the context that the future state was going to be. So the brief itself kind of defined that journey. Yeah. Whereas I think, in all honesty, I think now what we're seeing is that the brief is becoming like a never-ending dynamic thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be always on. It's always looking to refine itself, and it's always going to optimize, what the intent behind it is. And I think the things that are driving that really are the availability of data and the fact that data is dynamic in its nature. It's constantly being refreshed and updated. So you look at it 1 minute and it says this. You look at it the next minute and it says something probably not completely different, but it's more relevant. I think we're beginning to see a lot of clients and agencies trying to operate around outcomes of the effort that they put into something, as opposed to a traditional brief, which would maybe be more objective focused. Again, like here's the future state. This is what it looks like if we succeed. Also, I think budgets. Budgets have always been an interesting one in that there's been like a fixed nature to how much money is available to do something. And ideally, it'll move to a state where potentially that budget's a little bit more flexible and potentially even like self-funding in a way, depending on the success of the work itself. And then, I think, we mentioned it before, but if previously briefs were specifying, like the role of media in the process, I think what we might find is that briefs begin to start mentioning like the role for the human in the loop as things become a little bit more automated and autonomous.
No, that's super interesting. And just picking up on one of your points there around like the data that it's actually built on as well. So having that real-time data to be able to self-heal as well our campaigns as they're going, like you say, so they're automated. And I think another kind of outcome of that is also the fact that we can start pinning ROI potentially back easier to our campaigns as well. If they're built on those good data foundations, we're able to start fleshing out, okay, what kind of impact is this actually having as well, which is total gold dust, right, for a marketing team.
Yeah, definitely, because I think it flips the business model, doesn't it? And if there's anything that's severely under pressure at the moment for the creative industry, I would say it's the business model that's at the root cause of it. Mainly because it's it's based on time and materials, whereas actually it doesn't really value the work that gets created. You're kind of charging for the time it takes to make the work as opposed to the impact that the work has. So I'm a massive fan, big advocate for trying to shift everybody across to outcome based.
So diving straight back in, how do you think GenAI will impact the more traditional marketing analytics like attribution and mixed market modeling?
So I think GenAI won't be, and that's my opinion here is I don't think GenAI will be impacting the analytics as such, but I think it'll be impacting how someone consumes what comes out of the analytics. So I could quite imagine a scenario where, so in the past, it may be that some of the outputs from some of the standard analytics would be very much designed to be consumed by someone with a data science background, for example. And GenAI allows the possibility to more naturally consume the information that's in that kind of output. So, for example, allowing in natural language to be able to say, I see that this particular metric has changed over this period of time. Why? And allowing in the background some deeper analysis to happen, analysis potentially, or just even taking advantage of being able to explain something in a different way, but in more of a natural language, and actually also potentially producing infographics, or some kind of graphical infographics, but to be able to give a more visual output.
Yeah, I remember before sort of large language models, and if I was building a dashboard, you'd work with the business stakeholders, and they'd say, I want to see how this metric changes over time, and you'd write down all the questions, and you'd build the infographics or the graphs for that. And with Gen AI, if you can empower the business users to now do that themselves, that's a massive time saver and efficiency gain for them. Which is incredible.
Yeah, definitely.
Often when we also talk about large language models and their power, especially in the media industry, we talk a lot about personalization, and that can, the more standard forms can be in chatbots where you have a persona, or newsletters which you personalize to your entire mailing list. What does personalization look like on the GenMedia side? What's possible?
So this, I think, is a really exciting area. The possibilities from a personalization point of view are huge. And I guess almost to the point where there is so much you can do, you have to be kind of careful as to what you do. So I think what GenMedia and Gen AI allow us to do, and certainly will allow us to do, is take advantage of the data that you have around users. So where previously it may be, as you say, that you can be more granular. So as opposed to going for a wider segment and personalizing something to a segment, you're actually being able to, almost to the point where you can personalize per person. And that can be, so for instance, using models like Nano Banana Pro, you can take an image and you can take assets that you already have. So they may be assets that have cost quite a lot of money to produce, and be able to tweak those and change those for specific scenarios. So you end up with lots of variants on your assets. So it might be that you have a beautiful picture of your product, with a beautiful background behind it, but that's very London specific. And very easily you can feed something like that into Nano Banana Pro and say, change the wording and change the language and change the image in this image to be able to be specific to different cities. So that's kind of, it's kind of a fairly simple approach, but then you can start to really think about the data that you have about your users. So it might be seeing what has a user liked previously, what has a user bought previously, where does your customer live, what's the weather like in that particular location, all sorts of different data points that you can start to take advantage of, and be able to create some really interesting things. And that could be, to the point where you can, I've heard users, technical teams talking about the possibility of being able to, for someone speccing up a car, for example, being able to show them an image of that car sitting on their drive with a certain weather at a certain time. And that may be one step too far. And then, I think that's probably one of the serious points is there's a lot you can do, but at what point your end users might find that that's a little bit too much. But yes, hyper-personalization is very, very possible with the technologies that we have, and being able to do something at scale and at speed. So then, the question is, what is specific, particularly useful to your business?
Yeah, no, really interesting. I wonder if there's a world where, an ad that gets targeted to you is completely different to the ad that I see based on my persona and my search history or whatever. So.
Absolutely, yeah. I imagine travel adverts where here I am sitting in London, it's raining, and then I'm going to have lots of ads that are tailored for me for beautiful sunny places.
Yeah, that's one way to get you to travel.
Yes.
So we've talked about how GenMedia systems and Gen AI will evolve and how it'll get better and maybe more personalized to users. One question we often get asked as well is, will the system learn? Will it understand that, users are asking questions about a specific solution or a specific type? How do you embed learning into GenMedia solutions? What does that look like?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, isn't it, to be able to ensure that you don't have a generic system and that you can take advantage of experience within your organization, your unique IP, and be able to better your outputs using that particular the learnings within the organization. So I think there's a number of possibilities to ensure that learning comes into your models, and it could be done in different ways. It could be including in the context that you provide to a model to guide the outputs in a certain direction, and that might be brand guidelines. It could be the specific tone of voice, for instance, that you use in your assets. It could be a number of different things, and so that's kind of something that is done on the fly, can be adapted. It could be something that actually is changed per user, per scenario. You can insert different information depending on what's required to add learning where I guess the model understands more about the scenario that it is. But then I think then there's also then the feedback loop. So being able to evaluate. So we're talking about evaluation a number of times. So evaluating good outputs, bad outputs, and then feeding that back in to guide what is good. And good can be very subjective. So embodying, and then this is where I think it's really important to have a view of best practices. So, within your organization, what are your best practices for creating certain things, for creating certain outputs, and so being able to add that back into the model. I think there's also other possibilities around using RAG backends potentially, so being able to take advantage of bodies of information that you might have, and use that to be able to either give, here's an example, here are examples of really good approved ways of saying certain things, and being able to pull those in the background and feed those to the model at the time of it creating outputs. But also, potentially to one end is actually being able to actually tune models. So if you have, and tuning is a fairly large task to undertake. It's something, it's kind of probably more that you would do as a last approach, but it is possible, and you'd need a really good data set to be able to train your model on, to give, like a certain tone of voice potentially. But yes, that requires a fair amount of maintenance and upkeep, and assumes that the information that you're feeding into it doesn't change on a fairly regular basis as well. So yeah, there's a whole range of possibilities, I think.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And when you talk about, feeding into the model, that's updating your prompts and your prompt templates, right, of your main agents or your sub agents or tools that you're working with. So that's one approach, and the other would be looking more towards sort of fine tuning. What kind of customers, or for what kind of use cases would you consider fine tuning? You mentioned, it's quite intensive. You need a really good data set. What are there any scenarios you can think of where you would recommend fine tuning as sort of one of the main options?
It's a really good question. I find that actually it comes up fairly infrequently because of the overheads in doing fine tuning and that requirement for having really, really good data to train from. So I've talked about tuning recently from a translation point of view, where a customer has a large number of segments that they can use to be able to use around translation and certain language potentially. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because I think fine tuning is always an option, but we don't talk about enough how a lot of the times it may not be relevant, and this is a great example of a case where it can be relevant. Absolutely. Insights and analytics and tracking sort of the performance of a system or a tool is always really important, especially from a maintenance and productionization perspective as well. And for the more text-based generations, we often look at performance trackers and metrics. When it comes to GenMedia and generating image and video content, there's even metrics such as cost per generation, the latency or the time it takes to generate a video, acceptance rate. So, how many times do you generate an image, and how many times does it take before you actually accept the image that was generated? Those are some really interesting metrics and figures. So, according to you, what insights and analytics are a must or should definitely be embedded into GenMedia solutions? So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you've just said. I think it's, I think if you're not measuring something, you can't tell how good it is. Yeah. And what constitutes good obviously depends from use case to use case. So I think there's two pieces I would say on top of what you've said, which is, so I mean, you talked a lot about the outputs, and I think when you're using specific assets, there is a kind of, is it good enough for what we want to do, and then also then seeing how it performs when it's out in the wild as well. So click-through rates, that kind of good stuff, so I guess that's kind of normal. There's the bread and butter of what you would be doing from an assets point of view. I think also, like, one other side of that is also getting insights from users and what your users are doing. So it's interesting seeing what these systems might be and what they might look like and how people might interact with them. I know maybe 6 months ago, everyone was thinking that everything would be, we'd be using chatbots and typing lots of long, very wordy backwards and forwards with agents. But actually, very quickly, people have decided that that's really hard work. And actually, what I prefer is, if you give me a number of options and I can click on one and choose one. So I think it's really interesting. It's going to be really important to check that your users are happy with being interacted with in a certain way, that they the solution that you give to them works for them, and then also to know, for instance, the benefits that you've got from the solution. So being able to say, in the longer term point of view, this has saved us time, this has saved us money, this has made us more efficient, this has increased revenue. But yes, being able to have that longer term view.